woke up to the sound of metal clanking and a generator humming across the water. At first, I thought someone was doing early morning yard work, but when I stepped onto my back porch with my coffee, I almost dropped the mug. There were string lights stretched across my lake, not around it, across it. And floating in the center was a half-built platform with workers bolting sections together like they were building a stage for a concert. That's when I saw the banner tied between two temporary poles near the shoreline. Grand opening lakeside dining experience. My heart started pounding. Because that lake, it's not community property. It's not HOA land. It's mine. Legally mine. On the deed. On the tax bill. On the survey map. And somehow, my HOA had decided to open a floating restaurant on it. Before I tell you how this escalated into one of the most unbelievable showdowns I've ever experienced, make sure you hit like and subscribe. This is Karen Stories Daily, and if you've ever dealt with an HOA that thinks it runs the universe, you're going to want to hear every second of this story. Now let me make something very clear from the beginning, so there's no confusion. When I bought this property 8 years ago, the lake was included in the sale. It's a private lake basin that sits fully within my land boundaries. I maintain it. I pay the insurance. I handle the environmental upkeep. The HOA owns the roads, the clubhouse, and the community pool. That's it. But over time, the board started treating the lake like it was some kind of neighborhood attraction. At first, it was small requests. Can we host a family picnic near the water? Sure. Can residents launch kayaks for one afternoon during our summer fair? Fine, as long as it's supervised. I was trying to be a good neighbor. I didn't want conflict. Looking back, that was my first mistake. Because once certain people get comfortable crossing lines, they start erasing them. About 3 months before that morning, I noticed bright orange survey flags along the far edge of the lake. I assumed it had something to do with drainage or landscaping. Then flatbed trucks started delivering floating dock sections. Large modular pieces, not small. I walked down to the shoreline and asked one of the workers what was going on. He said completely casually, "We're building the HOA's floating restaurant." I honestly laughed. I thought it was some kind of neighborhood joke. He didn't laugh back. Apparently, the board had voted to create what they called a unique waterfront dining experience to increase property values and attract attention to the community. They had partnered with a catering company and planned to host ticketed events on weekends. Ticketed, as in paid entry, on my private lake. I immediately called the HOA president. I'll call her Denise. Calm voice, confident tone. The kind of tone someone uses when they think they're already right. She told me the board had reviewed the community documents and determined the lake qualified as a shared visual amenity space. I asked her one simple question. Did you check the deed? She said their attorney had looked into it. That response told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a calculated risk. They assumed I wouldn't push back. Within a week, construction accelerated. Anchors were dropped. Cables were run underwater for lighting. A temporary walkway extended from HOA-controlled shoreline toward the floating structure. I started documenting everything. Photos, video, drone footage from above showing clearly that the entire structure was positioned within my property boundaries. Then I called my attorney. He didn't hesitate. He said, "If what you're telling me is accurate, this is trespassing. And if they charge money, it becomes unauthorized commercial use. That escalates things." We sent a formal cease and desist letter to the HOA board. Denise responded with a neighborhood-wide email claiming the project was legally reviewed and would proceed as planned. She didn't mention my objection. She didn't mention the letter. Suddenly, neighbors started texting me congratulations. They thought I had agreed to this. Others were confused. So I sent my own email directly to the board, attaching my deed, property survey, tax records, and copies of the cease and desist notice. I made it clear. I do not consent to commercial activity on my lake. No response. Instead, they announced the official grand opening date. Friday evening. Live music, local chef, $75 per ticket. They were selling reservations. That's when I started thinking strategically. When I purchased the property, it came with a legally installed adjustable spillway system connected to an old agricultural drainage channel downstream. It allows me to lower the lake level for maintenance, shoreline repair, and algae management. It's fully permitted and inspected when used properly. I rarely activate it, maybe once every couple of years. But something interesting about lake maintenance is timing. If maintenance is scheduled and filed properly, it's completely within my rights. So I contacted the county office to confirm my next allowable maintenance window. Everything checked out. I submitted the required notification forms. Then I waited. Thursday afternoon, the day before their big event, Denise showed up at my door with 2 board members. She looked tense. She said lowering the lake before their launch would be community sabotage. I told her building a restaurant without property rights was private property sabotage. She accused me of acting out of spite. I calmly reminded her that we had already issued a legal objection and that construction continued anyway. I told her maintenance had been scheduled and filed. She warned me the HOA might pursue damages. I asked her to explain how they could claim damages for operating a business on land they didn't own. She didn't answer that. By sunset, I could see final decorations going up. Tables were being arranged on the floating platform. Lights tested. Speakers adjusted. It looked polished, professional, confident. At exactly 10 p.m., I walked down to the control point for the spillway. I opened the gates slowly, gradually, according to regulation. Water began flowing into the downstream channel exactly where it was designed to go. By midnight, the water line had dropped a few inches. By 2 a.m. it was noticeable. And as I stood there watching the reflection of those string lights slowly sink lower against the exposed shoreline, I realized something. They had built their entire plan on the assumption that I wouldn't act. By sunrise, the change was impossible to ignore. The waterline had dropped several feet overnight. What used to be a smooth, reflective surface was now a wide stretch of damp earth and exposed rocks. The floating restaurant platform wasn't floating anymore. It was tilted slightly to one side, resting awkwardly in thick mud. The string lights that had looked so magical the night before were now sagging low, some nearly touching the ground. I stood on my back porch with a cup of coffee, watching the quiet aftermath. No yelling. No drama yet. Just silence and a stranded structure sitting in the middle of what used to be a lake. Around 8:30 a.m., the first catering truck arrived. The driver slowed down as he approached the shoreline, clearly confused. He stepped out, looked toward the platform, and looked back at the nearly empty basin. He pulled out his phone. Within minutes, 2 more vehicles showed up. Staff members gathered near the walkway, whispering and pointing. At 9:15, Denise's SUV came flying down the neighborhood road. She stepped out fast, sunglasses on, phone in hand. The moment she saw the mud and the tilted platform, she froze. She didn't scream. She didn't storm over. She just stood there, staring. Then she looked at me. I walked down calmly to meet her halfway. "What did you do?" she asked. "I started scheduled maintenance," I replied. Just like I said. She accused me of timing it intentionally to ruin their launch. I reminded her, again, that we had sent a formal cease and desist letter. I reminded her that I had filed the maintenance notice days earlier. I reminded her that construction continued anyway. She kept repeating the word sabotage. I kept repeating the word ownership. By 10 a.m., word had spread through the neighborhood. Residents gathered along the edge, some disappointed, some curious, some clearly entertained. The banner that once announced grand opening now hung loosely, looking almost ironic against the empty lake bed. Then something happened that shifted the entire balance. One of the catering managers approached Denise with a stack of papers. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough. Their insurance policy did not cover operating on disputed private property. When they reviewed documentation that morning and saw the property records attached to my earlier email, they raised red flags. They refused to unload equipment. Denise argued with them for nearly 20 minutes. It didn't matter. No vendor was willing to risk liability. Around noon, she called an emergency HOA board meeting. It was held at the clubhouse that afternoon, and it was packed. People wanted answers. Some had already paid for tickets. Others were concerned about where their HOA fees had gone. Denise opened the meeting by saying the project had been approved under a reasonable interpretation of community guidelines. That phrase stuck with me. Reasonable interpretation. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't attack anyone. I simply walked to the front with printed copies of my deed. the official property survey, tax assessments, the cease and desist letter, and confirmation of my maintenance filing. I placed them on the table. I explained clearly that the lake has always been private property. I explained that I had previously allowed limited recreational use out of goodwill, not obligation. I explained that commercial activity without consent crossed a line. Then I asked one simple question. Did anyone on this board verify the property boundary documents before approving this project? Silence. One board member admitted they relied on verbal assurances that it would probably be fine. Another said they assumed I would eventually agree once the concept was finalized. Assumed. That word again. The room shifted. You could feel it. This wasn't about a fun community idea anymore. It was about authority being stretched beyond its limits. A few residents started asking questions about the budget. How much had already been spent? Were contracts signed? Were deposits refundable? Denise looked increasingly uncomfortable. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to suspend the project pending further legal review. That was their phrasing. In reality, it was over. The next morning, contractors began dismantling the platform. Anchors were pulled. Cables were removed. Trucks hauled everything away piece by piece. By the third day, there was no sign a restaurant had ever been planned. I didn't rush to refill the lake. I completed shoreline inspection first, exactly as environmental guidelines require. Sediment areas were checked. Minor erosion spots were stabilized. Everything documented properly. Then, gradually, I closed the spillway gates. Over the next several days, the water level returned to normal. The lake looked calm again, peaceful, like nothing had happened. But something had changed in the neighborhood. Residents began asking more detailed questions about HOA decisions. Financial transparency became a real topic. People who never attended meetings before started showing up. Denise sent out a community email claiming the launch had been postponed due to unforeseen environmental factors. Unforeseen environmental factors. Apparently, respecting property is important. Boundaries counts as weather now. What she didn't expect was that several neighbors had already seen the documents. They knew exactly what happened. At the next election cycle, 2 new board members were voted in. Denise did not retain her position as president. She remained on the board briefly, but without the same authority. I never received a direct apology, not officially. But I did get quiet nods from a few former supporters who admitted things had gone too far. And here's the part I want to make absolutely clear, because I know how the internet works. I didn't drain the lake out of revenge. I didn't do it recklessly. I followed every legal requirement. The maintenance window was valid. The downstream channel was designed for overflow. Environmental compliance was maintained. Nothing was damaged beyond temporary water level reduction. What I did was protect my property within the law. If I had stayed silent, that floating platform would have turned into weekend events. Then public bookings, then noise complaints, then parking overflow. Once a precedent is set, it rarely shrinks. Sometimes the only way to stop overreach is to calmly enforce boundaries. If you've made it this far, I genuinely want to know what you think. Was I justified in draining the lake before launch? Or should I have taken a different route? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all here on Karen Stories Daily, and your opinion might shape a future story. And if this story made you realize how far some HOAs can push when no one challenges them, share it with someone who lives under one, because boundaries matter. On paper, on land, and sometimes at the bottom of a lake.